Hello, my name is Dan Geer. As you know, I have a background in cybersecurity, as you probably know. Before that, I was in the world of biostatistics and epidemiology. I want to draw a little bit on that world for a tutorial, shall we say, and measures that might be relevant in the current setting and relevant to this audience. Again, I'm going to be relatively tutorial about this. We're going to do what amounts to an epidemiology drive-by. Because this is recorded, the recording, of course, is in the hands of the meeting's organizers, and they are welcome to put it somewhere to share. That's fine with me. Beyond that, let's go. I wish I could do this interactively, but that's not an option. So, let's turn to a little terminology. A population risk for an unfortunate outcome, like a disease, for example, would be derived in the most straightforward way. The number diseased divided by the size of the population. That is sometimes called prevalence. And it is a core number that you would want to have. But perhaps more interestingly, you would like to know what the risk is amongst those who have been exposed to some risk factor, whether that is something that's voluntary, like smoking, whether something that's involuntary, like being breathed on by somebody who's infectious. That is the risk of the outcome that you're worried about amongst those who have been exposed to the risk factor. You're also interested in the risk amongst those who have been not exposed to that risk factor. That is arguably more important because that tells you that what the baseline risk is for everybody if the exposure didn't exist. So if I have the rate of disease, if you want to call it that, if I have the rate of disease amongst people who were not exposed to the insult or to the mechanism or whatever you want to call it, to the bacillus that is of interest, then I have the baseline risk to the population at large. And from those two, I can calculate what's called a relative risk. In this case, strictly speaking, it is the relative risk of exposure. As it says here on the slide, that is simply dividing the one by the other. So if I have the risk amongst the exposed, and I have the risk amongst the unexposed, I can divide them and get what is called the relative risk. As an example, this is a standard sort of layout for such preliminary discussions. I have a 2x2 table. It might surprise you how much of the academic literature on epidemiology starts with a 2x2 table much like this. So this is fictitious data copied from a journal article that said it was fictitious data, and it just was easiest to go in that direction. So we have disease and no disease as the rows, and exposure and no exposure as the columns. And the risk of the disease is, if you look on the right there, 216, which is the sum of all that have disease, divided by the size of the population, which in this case is 499. So we have a risk of disease here of 0.433, or if you prefer, 43.3%. Amongst the exposed, it is 173 over 362, which is why I circled it. I was trying to make it clear what I'm doing here. That is the risk amongst the exposed of the disease, or if you prefer, the outcome of interest. Similarly, for the unexposed, we have, in this case, 43 divided by 137. The calculation of the relative risk is exactly what you would think. exactly what came from the previous slide. In this case, it's 0.478 divided by 0.314, or if you will, there's a 52.3% greater risk if you've had the exposure. So now we're beginning to get somewhere, if you will, in the epidemiology sense. This is the kind of thing that goes on, I guess I should say, constantly in epidemiologic settings. So we have a risk, general risk, a risk within the population, and we have a risk amongst those who have been exposed, and we have a risk amongst those who have been not so exposed, and from that we get a relative risk, which, as you can imagine, will continue to be of interest as I go forward in these slides. Let's do another terminology. Attributable risk. That is the difference in risk between those exposed to some risk factor versus those not so exposed. And in this case, it's just a one minus the other. Very straightforward. But what we're trying to get at is, for the population, how much of the risk can you assign to the exposure? That's what we're really after, is how much of the risk can you assign to the exposure? And what we have here is a term, again, it's a very common epidemiologic term, completely satisfactory in every way, of attributable risk, and it's RE minus RU. As you might guess, there is an example. The example uses the same data. I'm going to keep using the same data as long as I can here. In this case, you saw before that the risk amongst the exposed was 0.478. And you saw that the risk among the unexposed was 0.314. Those haven't changed. Now, however, I subtract the one from the other. And that's how much of the risk, how much it rises with exposure. It rises from 0.314 to 0.478, which is the attributable portion of the risk, and that is 0.164. So we've taken a little bit further step here and gotten the attributable risk for this exposure relative to this disease. And again, let me stress, that is the attributable risk with respect to some exposure, some event, some provocative something or other that you are interested in studying, compared to an outcome that you're likewise interested in studying. I'm just using exposure and disease here because that makes this most similar to readings in epidemiology that you might someday do. More terminology. Attributable risk percent. So now we're stepping forward one more little half step. This is the percentage difference in risk that is due to exposure, which is the attributable risk divided by the risk amongst the exposed. Now the attributable risk, as we saw in the previous slides, was the risk amongst the exposed minus the risk amongst the unexposed. So where in the third line here we have AR over RE, that's equal to the definition of attributable risk, RE minus RU, divided by RE. But since from the previous definition, relative risk is, I will back up and show you. Relative risk is RE divided by RU. So here, if we divide that equation, RE minus RU over RE, by RU, what we get is relative risk minus 1 divided by relative risk. Those are all just arithmetically equivalent, but I'm trying to show you what you might find, again, if you read an epidemiologic paper. Or if they use the terms different than this, you need to know that. So attributable risk percent is the percentage difference due to exposure. And again, there's an example, the same example. So before we calculated the risk amongst the exposed to be 0.478. And we calculated the risk amongst the unexposed to 0.314. We subtracted the one from the other, and we got 0.164, which is the attributable risk. We divide that by the risk amongst the exposed. And now we can say something that perhaps is interesting to those who are not performing the calculations, to people at large, if you will. And that is, in this case, 34.3% of the disease amongst the exposed is due to the exposure. Now let me step aside here for a second and say, of course, for a disease that has more than one cause and so forth, it's more complicated than this. I am just using the single exposure, single disease part here because it is straightforward to explain, even in a recording that is being done before a meeting where people will hear it. So let's just remember that this is for the single exposure, single disease case, and that there are complications when you move to multiple causes and the like. All of which, by the way, has all of that has an extensive literature. We're not going to go that way today. We're just going to say here that 34.3% of the disease amongst the exposed was due to the exposure. Let's do a little more. You saw before that the population risk, or R, is the number of disease divided by the size of the population. It's also occasionally called the prevalence. You saw before that R sub U, which is the risk amongst the unexposed. Now what we look for is something called the population attributable risk, percent, which is the percentage of the disease rate and the overall population that can be attributed to the exposure. This is important. In any case, it is R minus RU over R. In other words, you take the population risk, you subtract the risk amongst the unexposed, and you divide all that by the population risk. Why would you do that? And the answer is that will tell you how much disease would be eliminated if the exposure were eliminated. So if people stopped drinking, tainted water, how many fewer cases of some disease would occur? And that's how this example goes. Now we're taking the second column and the final. We calculated before the risk of 0.433. We calculated before the risk amongst the unexposed of 0.314. And now we take, as you see here, the difference between the two and divide it by the risk amongst the unexposed, and we get 0.275. In other words, 27.5% of all disease is attributable to exposure, which, as I said just a moment ago, means that 27.5% of disease would be eliminated if the exposure were prevented. And I'll remind you again, I'm talking about disease and exposure, but there's nothing about the math that requires this be about disease and exposure. It can be about anything that is a cause of change in a system and an outcome that you're interested in. In other words, why is this relevant? Each of these measures has its uses, where a stress produces some outcome. When I say that, I'm exhibiting a public health mindset. A public health mindset has a lot of ways to be described. One might be that you're interested in the population, not the individual. Another might be that you want to save the few, you have to save the many. Another might be that a action that might not affect a single person were you to do it, might not detectably affect a single person. Like if it was water, when you're drinking bad water and bad water was causing some disease, let's say, if I were to take a couple of hundred water filters and hand them out at random, I might not be able to measure any outcome difference. But if I could look at the risk amongst the exposed, the risk amongst the unexposed, and proceed as I'm doing here, perhaps you could change the public's health. Where there are expectations of what a stressor might produce, these measures can also help you test the veracity of those expectations. So when I say I expect that if I do this, I'll get that outcome, that is actually to a degree testable. And again, there's a large literature here that I'm not going to go into. This is to give you a sense of what you might be interested in pursuing on your own at a later time. The population attributable risk percent is perhaps the most relevant in the public health mindset, because it says, for example, if we got everybody to stop smoking or stop speeding or stop eating too much or whatever, what would be the effect on the population at large, hence on, for example, the expenditure of the public purse, hence on the amount of suffering that is present in the population at large, and so forth. This population attributable risk is perhaps the most relevant in that public health mindset. And why is that the case? Well, a public health mindset asks, how can I have fewer bad outcomes in the population? Not how can I arrange so that some person avoids a bad outcome. I'm not trying to save a particular person by giving them an antibiotic or something. I'm trying to save the population at large by cutting down on, say, the transmission of COVID-19. Suppose we consider cyber attacks as a stress, and the failure of in some sense, the failure of a target system as an undesirable outcome. This is completely consistent with the public health mindset, and I think there's a great opportunity for the teachings of public health to improve cybersecurity in the broad sense. And there are people working on this already. You may be aware of that, or you may not, but it is not an idea that's new with me. It is rather an idea that, well, if we're not succeeding in some general way, perhaps we should change the way we're working. John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State 6 decades ago, had a wonderful quote about that. He said, the question of success is not whether you have a hard or nasty problem to solve. It is whether it is the same problem you had last year. And so what I'm suggesting is that if we take a cyber public health approach, maybe by this time next year or next 2 years or something, maybe soon we'd be able to say we have different problems. That would be progress, believe it or not. Let's look at a fictional situation. The exposure might be an unpatched vulnerability of an endpoint. The outcome might be harm to that endpoint. I'm just going to let it go at that, just harm. So let's make up some data. Say 400 of 1,000 endpoints were found harmed. Maybe they have a bot. A botnet's a good example. So 400 of 1,000 were found harmed. We have, by some means, measured that 80% of the unpatched systems will be harmed in some way. Now we have the risk amongst the exposed, because we're treating the lack of patching as an exposure. Let's say that 10% of the patched will be harmed by some means. Not necessarily the same means, but will be harmed. So now we have a risk amongst the unexposed. From that, we can find that we have a relative risk of 8. That is to say, an 8-fold increase in the risk of disablement when you're not patched. Interesting. It says that the attributable risk is 70%. So 70% risk difference between the patched and the unpatched. Not very complicated arithmetic here, by the way. The attributable risk percent says that 87.5% of the population risk is due to the lack of patching. Again, the calculation is just as you saw in the terminology section before. So the risk amongst the exposed minus the risk amongst the unexposed divided by the risk amongst the exposed, or RR minus 1 divided by RR. And we get 87.5% of the risk is due to not being patched. And finally, the population attributable risk is that 75% of all disablements would have been avoided had patching taken place. Now again, you're looking at fictitious data, but this is the way you would think about it, if you were to take the part of the public health viewpoint that I'm suggesting you might want to look at. So here's a little example with I made it up data. I said this before, but I think is where I want to say it again. Your outcome doesn't have to be something that's unfortunate. It just has to be an outcome. It can just as easily be a good outcome after an intervention. The math is symmetric. It doesn't care whether it's an outcome that is good or bad. It just cares whether the outcome has been measured in some way that allows us to do the simple arithmetic calculations that I've shown here. Take some preventative measure, like patching, and say that a disease-free state is the outcome that we want. That's how they do vaccine analysis. By using the symmetric math here, only in this case the intervention is to result in a disease-free state. So here is the first half of a 2-slide set of terminologies. In evaluating interventions like a vaccination, there are 2 words that you will see in literature. One is efficacy. You will find that in, for example, new drug applications as they come to the FDA, to the Food and Drug Administration. How well some intervention works under controlled conditions, such as randomized, double-blind randomized laboratory tests with healthy volunteers. In other words, how well can this work? That's efficacy. How well can it work? And we control the environment where we test that so that we get a, frankly, upper bound on how well it can work. And then there's effectiveness. Very similar word, but effectiveness is how well an intervention works under uncontrolled or barely controlled conditions. The real world is messy. The real world will do things to you that you didn't expect. People will be late for their shots. They won't get the second one. They will, whatever it is. Effectiveness is in the real world. Efficacy is in the laboratory. Effectiveness is almost always less than efficacy, and the difference is something that you would be, as you might guess, interested in. I will say that, again, there's something here I'm ignoring, just for the record, for somebody who's quick on their feet. It is possible that some interventions make the situation worse. I'm not talking about those. There have been examples of that. When HIV vaccines were being prepared, there were examples of that. But I'm not going to go there. But if you already had that thought, I would suggest putting it aside for the next few minutes. So here's another bit of terminology. Again, symmetric math. Infection rate for unvaccinated people. IR sub U. Infection rate for vaccinated people. IR sub V. Vaccine efficacy. Does that look familiar? It should. It's the same symmetric math. IR minus IRU minus IRV divided by IRU. Nothing exotic here. So let's do another fiction. Suppose that our vaccine is enforcing password quality. And again, what we're using as an outcome, in this case, is account takeover rate. So make up some data. 120 out of 1,000 accounts that haven't had any password quality control exerted against them might be taken over. That gives us an IR sub U of 12%. Suppose that only 10 out of 1,000 accounts whose passwords were subjected to password quality control at the time of entry were taken over. That's a 1% IR sub V. And what we see here, again with the same math, is a vaccine efficacy, in this case enforcing password quality as a hopeful way to get account takeover rate down. Vaccine efficacy with this fictitious data is 91.7%. That's a fine value if you it's a fine value if you can get it, so to speak. Again, this is simple math, but it's something that I think some of you may well have data to work with. So let's fabricate a couple more examples of applications. Monadata and Wing published what I consider to be the canonic paper on the question of attack surface. And their title was an attack surface metric. You can look it up, it's well worth reading. They write, I'm going to quote this, if we create a newer version of a software system by only adding more resources to an older version, then assuming all resources are counted equally, the newer version has a larger attack surface, and hence a larger number of potential attacks. Software developers should ideally strive towards reducing the attack surface of their software from one version to another, or if adding resources to the software, such as adding methods to an API, then do so knowingly that they are increasing the attack surface. And again, that's a quote out of the canonic paper. Any version-to-version measure of attack surface in a body of code can be analyzed in the ways that we are describing above. Because if attack surface goes up, what you're saying is that risk is going up. And we can go back and work this into the kind of arithmetic that I've already showed you. Could we imagine that every upgrade of an application came with a relative risk comparing it to the previous version? Relative risk based on number of entry points or shared external dependencies and so forth. That is possible. And it's unlikely in the proprietary world. But in the open source world, perhaps we could get to doing this. Perhaps some public-minded organization or a set of individuals or just crazy people might want to start looking at this, or just historically go back and look at it. If you've got 15 versions of an open source library that is widely used, and you have a measure of its risk, such as the size of its attack surface, we could go back and look at the time rate of change of the risk, and hence relative risk, and hence attributable risk, to the change with respect to the changes in that software base over time. Would that change the world? I don't know. I doubt it. But we'll never know unless we try. Let's do another one. Pen tests, particularly recurring pen tests. In my view, at their best, pen tests don't tell you whether some code artifact can be broken. They tell you how much effort is required to break it. If I hire a pen test team and they come in and say, sorry boss, it's breakable, I'm not interested and they're not who I thought they were. If they come in and say 60 person years of labor and $1 million in hardware and so forth, you get the idea. That is interesting, because then I can go back and say, do I have any enemies willing to expend that amount of effort and money and what have you? So trying to gauge what a pen test tells you against what your threat model is where smart people go. So suppose a pen test is done regularly. That is to say, retesting some code base, some code artifact after improvements to it have been made. Now you have the makings of a relative risk comparison between the before and after versions. Could we imagine the kind of calculations, the kind of arithmetic that I've showed so far, comparing the impact that universal adoption of an improved version would deliver? Or could we, it would be more complicated, of course, and it would go to the multi-cause question that I said I was going to ignore, but could we say, here is the distribution of versions in the wild? Can we look at the attributable risk of each version to the population at large? Now I think you're onto something. Let's do another one. As you know, a lot of distributed denial of service attacks involve misusing otherwise legitimate services as amplifiers. I list 5 of them here. These are ones that are being sampled on a regular basis by a group called Cyber Green. You can go there and look under their statistics page and get a sense of how many DDoS amplifiers are there and how widespread they are and the like. You could do a population attributable risk percent calculation on, say, for example, open recursive DNS. You could do it on any of these if you have the data. And that is the kind of thing that I'm appealing to you here. If you have the data, perhaps we should talk. Or as I said at the outset, if you've got something to work with, steal these ideas and just let me know when you write the paper. That's also fine with me. But I'm trying to infect you with this idea. Let me do one more. Cyber conflict. Can we calculate some sort of plausible measure of the cyber attack risk to Ukraine, the infrastructure of Ukraine, a year ago and now? And from that, what would the risk measures that I've been talking about tell you about the effectiveness, the scope, and so forth of the Russian attempts at subverting the Ukraine, the infrastructure of the Ukraine, the cyber infrastructure of the Ukraine? I suspect there are people within the sound of my recorded voice that have some data to work with here. I think it would be very interesting. Going back quite a while, Bill Cheswick did a famous experiment when the bombing campaign around Bosnia and Serbia and so forth was being done by NATO. And what he did was continuous mapping of the internet, of the reachable internet in that part of the world while the bombing campaign was going on. And you might say, that's distasteful. I'm okay with that, but what he ended up showing was the effectiveness of the internet's routing protocols for getting around loss of connectivity, which of course was the whole point of the way the internet was designed in the first place, was to route around failure. And he used the circumstance of an active war to show that, in fact, those design principles were effective in the situation of constant loss of connectivity of one sort and replacement with connectivity of another sort, and how that went on. There's even, believe it or not, a movie on that. And I don't mean a movie with actors, I mean a movie of a map with little lights going on and off. You might enjoy finding that sometime. But in any case, we are right now at a situation where it is possible someone within the sound of my recorded voice has data that would allow us to do some of the calculations that I've been describing. And so I'm going to say that that is my contribution to today. I will also say that you're welcome to be in touch. I am dan@geer.org. I guess I should have put that on the slide, but I am dan@geer.org. I'm good about answering. I'm not good about answering promptly. Sorry about that, just the facts. But be in touch if you like. And I hope that at the end of the day, this proves to have been at least a tickle to your imagination. Thank you for the invitation, Jeff, and away we go.